My name's Lorraine Conroy, and I'm here to interview or have a conversation with Soo Choi, who's the Commissioner for Human Resources for the City of Chicago. And I think I'll just start with asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and then how you got to this role as the Human Resources Commissioner.
Sure. So I started my adult life as a lawyer, was in private practice for a couple of years, and then decided that I wanted to move into the public sector and looked at government jobs. So I was lucky enough to be hired by the City of Chicago's Inspector General's office in 2006. It was undergoing major change, and I'm really proud to have been part of the office at that time. So the Inspector General's office for the City of Chicago investigates allegations of misconduct, as well as reviews department policies, procedures, programming, audits, makes recommendations, does quite a wide range of things. And I was there until 2011. Up to that time, I was specializing in some way in investigating hiring misconduct. Anyone from Chicago, I'm sure, is familiar with the history of city hiring, and some unpleasant legacies that I'm really happy to say I think we have moved past. But at the time, I was looking into allegations of hiring misconduct, things like manipulating hiring processes to get a favored candidate in, things of that nature. And so when Mayor Rahm Emanuel was elected and looking to fill his team, one of his main priorities was to clean up city hiring. We were under the supervision of a court-appointed monitor, and he made it one of his top priorities to revamp city hiring so that we would no longer have to be under that supervision. And I was lucky enough to be the person he asked to do that. So that's how I ended up in this role.
Okay, great, thank you. So the City of Chicago has thousands and thousands of employees, and it's a very diverse city. And so I'm wondering how you and your staff build and foster a workforce that really reflects the City of Chicago.
Absolutely. I mean, it is the city's passion and definitely strong belief that our workforce should reflect the demographics of the city. It's challenging. I think that we face a lot of challenges that many employers, both public and private sector oriented, do face. For us, I think we constantly study our data. Because that's obviously where a lot of really important and useful information resides. We look at, a lot of times, we're looking at our recruiting numbers, the demographics of who's applying for city jobs, and taking that information and trying to be more thoughtful about recruiting. I mean, sometimes it's easy to just fall into patterns where you're just getting the word out through traditional means, whether it's print media or radio or nowadays social media and other ways. But recognizing that if you want to achieve true diversity, you really need to think about the different communities that exist in a city like Chicago. So one example I'll have is that when we decided to ramp up police officer hiring, we actually retained a firm to help us with the outreach and recruitment and communication. And so they worked very closely with Chicago police officers and really tried to look at the various communities of Chicago and figure out what's the best way to reach these neighborhoods. And it varied. I mean, it wasn't necessarily that a single race would be, recruited by certain means of communication, or that certain messages would resonate across the board. We found that, like, in some neighborhoods, people really took the advice of, say, their churches. Other places, maybe it's the gym or the barbershop they're at. We really looked at it in that much granular detail to figure out when, with the resources we had, how do we communicate with people to tell them about the opportunity, get them excited about applying, encouraging them to participate. So I'm really proud of those efforts because they've really made a large difference. And I think we're kind of taking that similar, very specified approach to our other city hiring. We also, for the first time, hired a chief diversity officer, which is a position that did not previously exist. because I think having the expertise of a chief diversity officer to look at the data in a different way, and not only just look at our hiring statistics, but also start to look at how we as an employer, how our workplaces foster diversity and encourage people to stay and think about more than just who we're bringing in, but how can we keep people, how can we make sure that we are truly a diverse employer, has been a great step in enhancing the efforts we've made.
So I'm going to follow up on that question. So can you give some examples maybe of some specific inclusion initiatives that have been undertaken since you've hired the Office of Diversity?
So our Chief Diversity Officer wears many hats, and one of the things that is very difficult in a place like the city is you've got multiple departments, and then you've got other entities that are part of the conversation, and trying to bring people together to really think about like how we do things is a monumental job, especially for us. We really wanted to engage departments to really think about what kind of workplace cultures they actually have, and talk to people at different levels. And we actually also decided to sort of take a small handful of departments of wide range, so anything from large infrastructure to something smaller and administrative. I think about 5 or 6 departments to use as sort of a way to pilot changes in procedures and policies. That way we can kind of see how effective they are before we do larger scale change. And the other thing is we've really wanted to engage City Council a lot more, because we feel that they are in touch with the citizens of Chicago and their constituents. And so one of the other things our Chief Diversity Officer has been doing is really engaging them in the conversation and including them in a way that I don't think that has been done before.
So you talked a little bit about outreach and whatever, how you've outreached to different communities. So I'm really curious about the changes in Chicago in demographics and how you've adapted to that. So we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years a big increase in the number of Latinos and Latinas, and a decrease in the number of African Americans who live in the city. And I'm just wondering how you've adapted to that.
Well, so we are, naturally, as a consequence of a larger Latino community, which is wonderful, we are seeing some advances and growths in our hiring. I will say it's not quite matching the growth of the population in the city, and so as we study our applicant data, for example, we're seeing that we're not seeing the percentage of Latinos in our applicant pool as we would expect, because, I guess to be kind of, it's say 30-something, looking at Latino, African-American, and white. We often see in our applicant pools in the Latino community less than 20%. So it tells us that we're losing something in the communication. So we started partnering with organizations in the Latino community that work on career development that might help us better reach out to potential applicants. We've been partnering with the Latino Caucus and working with them closely to figure out what are we doing here that isn't quite making the mark. And so I think that those kinds of initiatives I hope will produce better results. So speaking to the African American community, we are seeing not a large effect. I would say there's a slight decline in our workforce. However, it's not something that we want to see continue. So we think a lot about pipelines into city jobs. One of the things that we've done is the mayor has created this STAR scholarship. So anyone in Chicago Public Schools who graduates with a B average is able to go to Chicago city colleges for free. And the idea is that we're putting them into college and helping them get education in areas that we need to see more diverse applicant pools down the line. So there's this idea of growing from a very early level. In addition, we're also working on partnerships, for example, with the United Negro College Fund to make sure that we are not only looking at Chicago, but we're looking nationwide at promising African American candidates throughout the country who might see Chicago as a potential place to live, as the city of Chicago as a potential place to work. So, kind of looking at it in multifaceted ways.
So you touched on this already a little bit about how you manage a large number of departments, but in the city I can imagine that there's a very large number of departments, each of which has its own mission. Right. And how do you get everyone on the same page or working towards a common vision for the city?
I mean, the city is a unique place in the sense that we provide probably every single kind of job that exists, everything from lawyers, police officers, laborers, doctors, veterinarians, accountants. I mean, it's such a wide-ranging employer in that regard. So the way we have it set up is that every department has what we call a human resources liaison. And in some departments, it's a full-time job, and for some departments, it's maybe their timekeeper because of the size of the department. But so my department sort of manages that in the sense that we meet with them on a regular basis, and we use those meetings to communicate changes that are coming into play, also to just hear feedback from them about what kinds of issues they're facing. I think one of the things that's been helpful is that we really kind of see ourselves with respect to the liaisons as a true service organization. We don't want we're not trying to get anyone in trouble. We want to be helpful, and we always want to be around to brainstorm over. Human resources is a crazy world. There's all kinds of unexpected issues that arise, and just having a resource and someone to sort of help guide through difficult issues is, I think, something that they appreciate. We also, if we are going to let's say, look at major changes or develop a larger policy, we're going to definitely look at the stakeholders and ensure that they're part of the conversation. So it's not like typically we don't just write a policy, throw it out there and say, here, this is how we're going to do it. As we're writing, as we're developing, we take into account who it's going to affect the most and involve them in the conversation so that we can try to come up with something that's going to, at least, it's not going to be perfect necessarily, but try and be respectful of the various operational difficulties various departments have and try to find a balance.
So what does I guess this is also a follow-up question, but what does your department do to foster a healthy workplace? Mm-hmm. And so are there policies and rules that either help or hinder those efforts?
I mean, so I think it's very much in tune with things that we hear about all the time now. I mean, EEO is a very important area for any employer, and I think that involves not only having a strong and clear policy, but having the mechanism in place so that people who may have issues feel comfortable raising those issues, and they feel that if they are, let's say, they have a complaint that they want to put forth, that it's going to be addressed, it's going to be treated with respect. That is, I think, something very important, and it also goes along with policies like violence in the workplace. So I think you obviously have to have certain core fundamentals so that your employees know that they have protections and that they have rights and that they have ways to express the things that concern them. Within my own department, I would say we also sort of more informally, we encourage our managers to be just, receptive and communicative with employees. What I find is that, if you foster a spirit of collaboration and also just make it clear, you've got leadership that's aligned, people aren't going forum shopping looking for a different answer from one manager to another, and kind of know that your leadership is all on the same page, is something that's very helpful, as well as just making sure your employees know that they're supported. Human resources being very human-oriented, errors will be made, mistakes will happen. I think that making sure that people feel like, okay, like you make a mistake, but we all stand together. Ultimately, I consider myself as the commissioner of the department, ultimately responsible for that. I think that this notion that someone could get thrown under the bus is something that really demoralizes people. I've taken responsibility for every error that my department's made. I think that that's just part of what it means to lead a department. I think I've had a lot of employees appreciate the fact that I've always said, look, just tell me what happened. We will figure it out together. You're not on your own, and I think that's really strengthened the morale of my workplace.
So I think we're going to open it up now in the last few minutes for questions from the audience, and then if there's a little more time, I have a couple more questions, but I think we'll open it to questions from the audience now. Yeah, okay.
You said that there was a slight decline in the African-American. Do you have any reason why?
Well, I think that as the population has diminished, we're seeing some declines in the percentages in our recruitment pools. I think that's just statistically, it just makes sense. If we have fewer African Americans living in the city, it could affect our percentages and just how the demographics play out in the applicant pools.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for your thoughts. Just continuing on the discussion, I mean, it's very easy for leaders to kind of get on board with some of the good principles you've talked about related to diversity, inclusion, healthy work environment.
Right.
Talking to a room full of HR leaders, we get it. But in order to really embed some of these things in the DNA of the organization, it's really that kind of middle management that's got to get it, and then they've also got to practice it. What are some of your lessons around what works and what doesn't in order to really get that layer of the leadership to help drive the culture you're trying to create?
I agree, absolutely. I mean, middle management oftentimes touches this layer of employees that, and they have the ability to make the most impact. I mean, one of the things that we've really thought about is training. Just because I think sometimes people just need that refresher course to be reminded of the various principles that go into managing a diverse workplace. The other thing that, at least for us, because my department houses the EEO division, we often are the recipient of a lot of complaints that may not rise to the level, even if true, of a policy violation, but clearly tells us there's something going on. So we've decided to start using that information to communicate with department heads and say, look, we really think you need to take a closer look at this particular division, because we're seeing complaints that at least show us that people are not happy, or we're seeing something that could later on become a much more serious problem, and really trying to get ahead of it and trying to hold department heads a little bit more accountable for not just receiving the information, but letting us know what they did with that information. So I think in some instances it means talking to, say, a middle manager and figuring out how to what tools do they need to be better attuned to, say, picking up on those kinds of things, as well as responding when issues arise. So, I mean, those are just a couple of the things that we've been working on.
One more, okay.
What are some new initiatives that you plan to tackle with the new administration coming in?
Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know, since we don't know who the new administration is. So I guess that's to be seen. I'm sure there will be changes coming down the line, because any new mayor is going to take a look at what's going on, and I'm sure they're going to want to put their own stamp on it. So hopefully I'll be around to help with that.
All right, I think we have I have one more question if there aren't any others. So the work I'm doing is really focused on temporary and low-wage work, but I'm wondering if there are jobs in the city that have been, which types of jobs or others that have been most affected by either outsourcing, privatization, and then as a follow-up to that, is there a move to replace full-time work with temporary or part-time workers?
So we have not really been much affected. We don't outsource really very much. I think the last major outsourcing initiative that I can recall was to outsource 311, but I think after a really careful analysis of how that would work in terms of making sure that the flow of communication was smooth between the police department and the Office of Emergency Communication and Management. It just made sense to just keep it in-house. So I don't see us doing a lot of privatization. Outsourcing really for us, I think, we look at it more as if there's some sort of work that's going to be discrete, that will only last a certain amount of time, then it may make more sense to hire a third party to do that work versus hire a full-time employee only then to maybe not need them down the line. It hasn't really affected us. It's just kind of the way we operate. And in terms of replacing employees with like part-time or temporary, I mean, when we see a need for temporary workers, that tends to lead us to think we might need to outsource something. So that's usually how that thought process goes. And then in terms of part-time workers, I don't really see it as much as replacing full-time workers. We are, I think, starting to think about how to provide more flexibility for our workforce. So like looking at part-time employees, for example, it might be as we struggle to, say, retain young women in the workplace, maybe women who are mothers of young children who, a part-time work arrangement might suit them and might allow us to keep them, and I've lost employees for that reason. It gives us reason to think about how we might want to be more flexible to hold on to talent. So it's not so much replacing as it is thinking about different options to sort of maximize how we get things done and to make sure we're holding on to really good people.
All right, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.